Jason King is Executive Director of the Center for American Archaeology in Campbellsville, Illinois. He received his BA from the University of South Carolina and MA and PhD from the University of New Mexico. Jason's first experience in Illinois archaeology occurred at the University of New Mexico Center for American Archaeology Field School at the Mound House site in 1999. Since 2001, he has directed field work at several sites. Most recently, his work is focused on geophysical prospection and excavation of middle woodland mound sites, including the Mound House and Golden Eagle sites and excavation of the historic Campbellsville Lock site. His research investigates the roles of mortuary practices, mound building, kinship, and ideology in the formation and maintenance of social groups during the woodland period. Jason has been here previously. Last year, obviously, we had him strictly on Zoom. This is probably his fourth or fifth time here, and he just always uncovers very interesting information relative to this subject matter. So would you please welcome Jason King.
Thank you. Let's see here. Need to go back. Thank you, Jared, for inviting me again. I'm always glad to be here. I always enjoy doing this presentation. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jason King. I'm the director of Center for American Archaeology. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is something new. Not new in the sense of something we recently discovered in the archaeological record, but sort of a new project that we've started at the CAA with our field schools. And really sort of moving outside of my initial interests that brought me here into the lower Illinois Valley. And so I have more questions and problems than I have answers for you tonight. But I'll try my best to answer any questions that arise from this. And before I start, I should say that all of the work that I'm going to tell you about here today, this isn't my work or just my work. This is work that's been done by CA staff, our field school staff, and our regular staff, college, high school, university students, adults that come through our field schools every summer. So we've been working on this since 2019, and they deserve a lot of credit for everything. I'm kind of distilling what they've discovered through their hard work, whether it's in the field or in the lab or in future analysis. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the German site, and I'm going to start off by saying the German site has nothing to do with Germans as a nationality and or the country. The site was named after property owners when it was first recorded. And just to sort of orient you, we're located in the lower Illinois River Valley in Calhoun County. Has anybody ever been to scenic Calhoun County? Okay. So if you know where Campbellsville is, we're just, the site is less than 1.5 miles from Campbellsville, the McCully Heritage Project. And I should also thank McCully Heritage Project for generously allowing us to do field work at their site. If you're into hiking, any sort of outdoors, camping, horse trails, scenic overlooks, nature, trees, please visit the McCully Heritage Project. But what I'm going to talk about is the site here in this field where this red star is, and this is the German site. Now, the German site has been known for a while, at least to archaeologists, in the State Archaeological Survey. It's in the record of sites. However, it didn't really become known to us or catch our attention until 2019. And it wasn't for, I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to tell you is the opposite of the way you should do normally research, right? You start with a question. In this case, we started with a logistical problem. Was anyone around in 2019? Does anybody remember what happened in the summer of 2019? It was a huge flood. In our museum, we had a little over 4 feet of water. So it also made it impossible to get to the site we planned to excavate. And then it made it impossible to get to our backup site as they evacuated the floodplain. And so McCully Heritage actually invited us out to excavate there, and we quickly began looking for a site to continue our work. And luckily, this kind of lined up temporally with some of our earlier projects. So it worked out. But before I get too much more into that, let me just tell you a little bit about the chronology of the lower Illinois Valley, or remind you of it if you already know it. Okay. So people have lived in the lower Illinois Valley and the surrounding areas for over 10,000 years, right? Did anybody know that before you got here? People have lived here for over 10,000 years, and the materials that they left behind in the course of living their lives are abundant in the Illinois River Valley, and it is really one of the unique archaeological records of North America and the Midwest. And we've been investigating at the CIA focusing in this area since 1958. And the part of the record that I'm going to talk about is the woodland period. The woodland period, just to be very brief, is the period in which pottery appears in the archaeological record, people beginning about 600 BCE. Does everybody know BCE, BC, same thing? Pottery appears. We have a little gap in our archaeological record, sort of towards the end of the early woodland and the middle woodland, when the very sort of robust mound building tradition appears in the lower Illinois Valley and the Central Valley. If you're familiar with that, about 2,000 years ago, what archaeologists call Hopewell was a period in which there was a lot of mound building, populations moving into the lower valley. They're bringing in raw materials from around the mid-continent and elsewhere, including the Gulf Coast, the Appalachians, out in Wyoming, etc. The late woodland period follows that, sort of with the end of what's been called interregional trade, logistics network, what have you, however you want to interpret the monumentality and the extra local items and finished goods that come through. And the late woodland period is, as you can see up here, from about 400, give or take, to about 1,000, give or take. And it actually goes on a little bit longer than that, depending on where you look. And so it's about a 600 to 800 year time period that is known. There's a lot of material around, but it doesn't get a lot of attention as the earlier sort of middle woodland time period. And of course, in the Midwest, not as much as, does everybody know what comes after Mississippian? After late woodland Mississippian period? Is everybody familiar with Cahokia? Has everybody been to Cahokia? If you haven't been, go to Cahokia. Hopewell and Cahokia sort of eclipsed late woodland for various reasons. And so we have been investigating that most recently at the German site. And the time period we're focusing on is the Jersey Bluff phase from about 800 to 1200, depending how you juggle the dates. Again, it's sort of eclipsed by the earlier middle woodland period. You can see a large bluff crest mound. You can see some of the very well-crafted pipes and a pot with a bird representation on it. Highly decorated, artistic sort of material assemblage. Of course, and then after that is Cahokia, if you've been there. It's a very large, very large mounds are built there, hundreds of mounds. It was North America, the mid-continent's real urban center, right? They're beginning around 1050 or so. So late woodland kind of gets overlooked, and we're going to talk about the late woodland, that last part, Jersey Bluff. And to talk about it, I'm going to go through what we've been doing at the German site and hopefully start to make some sense of what we found over the past couple years. We were able to do some field work in 19. We were able to do, with COVID in the fall, 2 whole weeks of field work, and then we had a very well-attended and strong summer this year. So, this little screen's hard to see sometimes. So up on the right there, you can see, or my right, you can see a little marker that marks Campsville and the German site. You can see Campsville down at the bottom, and the German site's that open field. And what this slide also shows on the left is, I'm going to show you a couple things people don't often get to see, or sort of little bits of information from the state site files that are useful for archaeologists. You can see that the German site is 377 on this map. You can see it's surrounded by other sites. The one here, 195, is the Evie site, another Jersey Bluff habitation or residential site that the center excavated in 1993. There's a couple sites that we don't have good information about time. They're unexcavated. And then there's a mound site located on there, also Jersey Bluff. And this just places it on the landscape for you. What I want you to notice is where that 377 is, how little of that open field and the trees above it that it takes up. Now, the site was originally documented in the 60s and 70s, and you can see the sort of sketch maps that archaeologists often turn in to describe a site. Right there, that little dotted line, you can't read it very well. We couldn't read it very well, but it says late woodland and Mississippian pottery in there. In the 70s, a little better map was drawn, but not a lot of information about where things are coming from. So what we were able to learn, though, from the records is that there are a late woodland assemblage and a Mississippian assemblage. So Mississippian, again, associated with Cahokia, and this late woodland Jersey Bluff assemblage that is associated with the lower Illinois Valley in the times preceding in the American Bottom, different phase names of the rise of Cahokia. So our big first step out there was to do remote sensing. If anyone's familiar with the center and its history or familiar with archaeology on television, you also see great big blocks of soil moved away, and they're excavating slowly across a big space. And what archaeology has been working to in the past decade or so is to dig a little smarter and a little less, to sort of focus what we can do. And so our first attempt at fieldwork out there, our first fieldwork out there was remote sensing. Specifically magnetometry. What you're seeing in black and white and gray up there is the results of a gradiometer being walked back and forth across that entire field. I don't know if you can see oh yeah, you can see the squares, right? Those are 20 meters by 20 meters, those squares. So students and staff walk back and forth every centimeter of this field to basically measure variation in the Earth's magnetic field in the space. When the ground is disturbed, say you excavate a pit to throw your trash in or to store something in, and you put the soil back in, it has a different magnetic signature than soil that's just accumulated over the long life of the earth and the soil. And so what you can see in this, I'm gonna have to turn a little bit so I can see a little better. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so most of what's in this is actually only mildly interesting. If you can see the big Y-shaped thing that's black and white, very high contrast, there's several like that. Those are erosional ditches where the topsoil is eroding off and down into these gullies. Where you see sort of over there, a very big white circle with a very dark black circle in it. You'll see several others like that, or just high contrast black against white. Those are ferrous metals. So if you think about your 4th grade science class when we're talking about magnetic fields, you're seeing the north and south poles of those. What we're interested in are the fuzzier, grayer areas, not the light gray, but the darker. Those are magnetic anomalies, and those are places where the soil somehow has a different magnetic signature. And potentially, they are archaeological features, right? Features are non-portable artifacts like pits and hearths and house basins, post molds, what have you. Not really post molds at this resolution. But this allows us to target where we're going to excavate rather than being out in this big field digging around for months and months and coming home with nothing. So without any, let's see, turn this back. Any more on that? I'll come back to this in a minute. Let me just show you some of the stuff that we found at this site. So what you're seeing on this slide on my right, yeah, my right, is a section of the magnetic results right from the middle of the field. You'll see the gold rectangles. Those are 1 by 2 meter excavation units, and there's some red ones and blue ones. Those are 1 by 1 meter units of some volunteers and some scouts helped us excavate just to the base of the plow zone to see if we could find the top of features. What we're trying to do is determine what these are and what this living space was, and this turned out to be very successful because you can see we target our units right where the blobs were. And so the arrows sort of point to what they are and where they are. So over here on my left at the top, this is a big roasting pit that we found. This was sort of bell-shaped, and it's just a large pit that was excavated in the ground. There was nothing in it but charcoal, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of pottery, and lots of burnt soil, lots of charcoal, a little bit of burnt limestone. Limestone is very common in residential sites in the valley. There's a lot of limestone around. At the bottom, though, you can see that there's the stain in the ground. Can you see that? On one side, it's yellow. On one side, it's very black and gray. That yellow is the natural soil. That's the soil that's accumulated there. That dark soil is organically enriched soil that's been placed in what turned out to be a very large pit in the ground, and it's basically full of refuse, trash, things that people are done with. But this is important trash, and I'm going to tell you why. Because when we excavated down to the very bottom of it, everywhere we put an excavation unit into that big blob with the 4 gold rectangles, the base of the arrows at, we found post molds. Can you see those circles up there? Those are spaces where posts had been excavated, put in for the walls. What you're looking at is the foundation where the walls were of a structure. And so this is very important because we don't have a lot of good examples of Jersey Bluff houses during this time period. You know, it's 800, almost 600, 800 years, and there are, I think, less than 7 houses that have been documented. So this was pretty exciting to find. You can see that we found a corner. In fact, everywhere we put a unit in this thing, there was a post mold. And you can kind of see it's washed out, but that's one cut in half, like down the middle of the profile. Same thing here. At the top, you're seeing what is the side of a unit. Can you see how the ground has sort of a natural contour, then the dark soil dips down? That's the basin of the house. And I'll tell you what we found in the house in just a second. Those excavated, unusual shapes were where post molds were. We found very large features. You can see at the bottom on my left. Again, the yellow soil is a natural soil, and this was we weren't sure what it was, and we then consulted with some colleagues that were also doing late woodland stuff, and the consensus is right now these are just sort of called bathtub features. They have that bathtub shape to them, like old-footed cast iron bathtub, you know what I'm talking about? They have this shape, and they appear to have all sorts of basic residential debris in them, whether it's faunal material, deer bone, fish bone, mussel shell, pieces of broken pottery, debris from stone tool making. So that was in there. In fact, those kinds of things were also in the house basin. What it appears that they were doing when they were at this site, again, here's the base of the house again. Can you see the post molds next to the arrow? And can you tell that's a little red in the top corner there? That's a hearth right at the base. So what you're looking at really is the floor of this house, which would have been the living surface that people lived on in the past. And what we're finding at this site is we're not finding, as we do other sorts of archaeological sampling across the site, we're not finding debris scattered across the site like we might find at other sites. In fact, we're finding it all inside these pits or in these house basins. So they're living in them for a time, and it appears to be tossing all the trash in there once they're done with the house, which, you know, may make sense. Again, these are sunken floor basins, right? So you dig it, line it with walls and build up. Now, one of the interesting things that we did find in this house basin, in the units we excavated in, we did find some fragments of maize. Maize is interesting because it's an important part of sort of the emergence of Cahokia in the Mississippian period, but maize arrives in the lower Illinois Valley and other places somewhere around 900 CE or AD if you prefer. And so its appearance and the fact that they were using it was transformative of local cultures, but it gives us a good horizon marker for understanding what's going on. We actually radiocarbon dated that piece of maize, or corn, if you're not familiar with it. And you can see up there basically what the age of it is. There's, let me back up here. On my right, you can see a handful of Jersey Bluff radiocarbon dates, those squiggly little hills. All those are probability distributions. This is a good thing to remember. If anybody ever asks you or you read anything about radiocarbon dating, nobody's going to radiocarbon date and give you an exact date. All radiocarbon dates are ranges. They're estimates of time, not a single year. So if somebody says that dates to this year X, they've got either have a lot more information other than radiocarbon or they're making it up. But here are the dates, and these have been modeled to sort of estimate how long this phase is. You can see that up there, about 880 to 1210. And you can see that our German date in red sort of falls near the end of that. So granted, it's only one date. We can't estimate duration of it, but we can look at the pottery too and other artifacts and try to get some estimate of time. But nonetheless, it appears that at least that corn, that house perhaps, was used sometimes between 1040 and 1210 CE. If that is correct, that is into the time period where Cahokia is actually starting to take off. This is important because we find, despite the field notes for the site before we got there, very little evidence of Mississippian things there. The conventional wisdom with regard to Cahokia, as it exploded and whatever it was that drove all that, there's a lot of debate, and we don't have time to get into that, but that the lower Illinois Valley was kind of a hinterland, or perhaps a farming area to support the populations at Cahokia. And what's interesting is, with the exception of a couple sites like the Audrey site and a few others, we really don't have a very robust Mississippian record like we do the semi-contemporaneous Jersey Bluff record. So for some reason, and it's been hypothesized that there was a process of acculturation where Mississippians moved in and local people adopted some culture. There's some suggestion that perhaps they were not just interested, or it just filtered in and slowly took over. The fact is, we really don't know, and they very well could have been just uninterested in resisting whatever it was that drove people to aggregate at Cahokia. So keep that in mind. This next slide just shows you some of the pottery. If you remember, and I did show you an example of a kind of fancy pot, but the one that had the bird iconography on it, which is a Hopewell vessel, Jersey Bluff Times, and maybe this is part of the reason it often gets overlooked or underappreciated, they're not fancily decorated vessels very often. However, they are well-made vessels, and technologically they are a little more advanced in that they could be placed directly on fire. Hopewell vessels weren't for cooking, but nonetheless, pottery has improved in a technological sense during this time period. And what we found largely was the kind of pottery you might see. You can see up there, there's a rim sherd. These are the rims of big jars or bowls. You can see little notches on that lip there. But most of these are, kind of plain. They're cord marked. They have cord marking on them from the process of forming it. One interesting piece of pottery that we found that made us ask a lot of questions is on my right here. Can you see that that's a bump or a node at the edge of that pot? That is, you can't see it very well, I don't think, on the wall, but that is a style of pottery from the central Illinois Valley called Mossville, and it's decorated in a specific way that doesn't show up in the lower Illinois Valley commonly or frequently. And they're also shell-tempered. Does everybody know what temper is in pottery paste? The aggregate that you mix in to strengthen it. We also find shell-tempered, which is a signature of Mississippian times, right? So we're seeing some evidence of potteries that have elements of non-lower Illinois Valley manufacture and design, but we're not seeing a lot of them. There are a few pieces. We did find in the house, I don't know if you can tell on the wall here, can you see those cracks in there? Okay, those are 3 separate pieces that were found in 2 excavation units of a whole vessel. Now, before I forget, a graduate student at the University of Illinois is actually going to do some preliminary testing to see if we can't do some sourcing studies on the materials used to make these pots, and so we can investigate how people are interacting. But this is sort of standard late woodland pottery. We did find, as I said, shell-tempered pottery. Can you see the little flat semi-rectangular flakes on those right there? That's crushed shell. And this really only shows up with Mississippian culture. And this is, again, thought to be one of these signatures of Mississippianization, or the import of Mississippian culture from Cahokia. Boy, they really don't like shell pottery, huh? But again, this is one of these semi-non-local, right? This evidence of interacting with people from different places that appears in the lower Illinois Valley. For those of you that are very excited about projectile points, the lithic manufacturing evidence that we find at the German site is particularly non-spectacular if you really are into flint knapping. What we find are little arrowheads, convenient little ones made out of flakes, side notch, and we found a handful of these. So that was kind of our 2019 year. I would just like to point out that in the lower valley, we do find some Mississippian style. This is from Wetterson, 1983, his thesis, and that's one of the few maps of, notice that's from 1983, one of the few maps of a Jersey Bluff house prior to our excavations. One of our students in 2019 is a project. I promise you don't have to try to read all that because I'm going to sum it up in one sentence. She used our magnetic data and our excavation data to create a statistical model to try to determine which of those blobs on that magnetometry map were most likely houses. And so we identified those using her approach and went out to test those this year. And you can see there's a lot of blue blobs in the central part of the site. There's a lot of other things going on. You can see sort of in the middle, there's these big circular ones that appear to be probably pits. But what we found by the end of the season is a fact, and this isn't a critique of the method, but really only 3 of them turned out to be additional house basins. You can see one right there. Again, you can notice the difference between the natural soil and the organically enriched soil that fills the house basin, and those flecks of color that you can see over on my left are burnt limestone that was, again, pretty common at residential sites in Illinois Valley, but also pieces of, stone tools and pottery. Again, here's another view of a house basin. This is near the bottom. There's some odd trenchway. Trenching isn't normally what occurs during this time, but nonetheless, we have that too. The post molds were a little different, and the pictures weren't great. I don't know what happened in the field. Can you actually see? I don't know how to adjust this to make it better, but can you see there's kind of like little gray blobs by those letters? They're smaller posts. I don't know if this is, we don't know for sure yet if this is slightly earlier, slightly later, a different construction technique. We're going to excavate more of this next year. What was interesting, though, in the middle of the site, one of the potential houses wasn't actually a house, but rather it was a very large feature, appears to be circular based on what we can see of it, that was full of hard-baked, very dense clay. And it wasn't clay collected like daub, but in fact it was the ground. This is clay soil that was burnt in a very high temp fire. There's lots of charcoal, there's ash in there and burnt earth. So centering, where we've been excavating, is centering, as you can see, where the houses are. There appears to be at least one large, very large burning surface, and possibly others in storage pits around it. So when I look at that, I don't have a pointer, but you can see, so basin 1 right above it, the odd blob, that's the house. There's another one where the fire pit was, and we excavated some of those other blobs. And again, they were all features, and 2 of them, it's a little, this size-ish, most of them, refuse pits, storage pits, roasting pits, and with 2 houses around it. One of the unique things about the Mississippian archaeological record, especially closer to Cahokia, is a sort of, and at the Audrey site, they think they see this too. I believe they do. Organization of space, of living space. So Cahokia is, Monk's Mound is there, but there are several plazas in which structures were organized around. And so one thought is, do we have that kind of, at least, organizational structuring of communities in the Illinois Valley? And, based on Claire Hankla's model and what we saw, it sure, without excavating, it looks very, kind of rectangular, and you got a big fire pit, and you got some other storage pits, what have you, in the middle. However, excavating those, again, only 3 of them actually turned out to be houses. The others are other kinds of features that were either still excavating or we're not entirely sure what they were for. Okay, so what's the point in doing all this other than doing archaeology? We don't just dig to be digging, we're asking research questions. And our interest really goes back to the question of Mississippian and lower Illinois Valley interactions. And this had been marked as a space where both of those records co-occur. There's a number of sites identified by Ken Farnsworth and his colleagues where there's a predominantly Jersey Bluff record with some Mississippian pottery and artifacts suggesting some sort of interaction. However, in our 2 and some change years of working there, all the Mississippian sherds could fit into your hand. In fact, we didn't find any in either of the house basins that we excavated this year. However, in 2019, we did find Mississippian pottery. We found corn that dates to the time of Cahokia. And we found the Mossville pottery that's contemporaneous from the Central Valley. Clearly, people were coming there or interacting in some way that was bringing a material assemblage that looked like at least a portion of the materials from other places, which suggests some form of interpersonal communication or interaction. As archaeologists, this is what we're really interested in. I mean, artifacts are awesome, don't get me wrong, but we're interested in the people behind them. And so the question emerges then, how is it that people living in the lower Illinois Valley who appeared to hang on to or maintain a late woodland lifestyle in the face of sort of the Mississippian, Kochian developments in the American bottom, in fact, in the Central Valley, why were they doing this? And how did they accomplish it? It appears that they were interacting, and there's a number of hypotheses, and we hope to continue testing these in the coming years. And this is the part where I have only questions for you, really, and not answers for you yet. We see interaction, and we're testing for it, and we know that people interacted across long spaces, often longer or at greater distances than popular culture, even archaeologists give them credit for in the past. So, what we're trying to do is answer these. Was it that Mississippian, American bottom, Kochian culture drifted into the Illinois Valley and somehow intermingled? Did the people that lived there resist it? Did they say, hey, we've been living here for over 1,000 years, we like what we're doing, and we're not really buying into this? Did they resist it? These aren't questions that we can readily ask yet, but they're questions that archaeology can ask, and this is the beginning of doing that. So, that's where we are. That is not all the excavation units that we did, and I should have said those red ones were 2 by 2 meter units. And so we're continuing to excavate out there, and we want to try to build a bigger narrative and further explain why it is that we're seeing the record we do and give this time period a little more attention, because it deserves it. And with that, I think we're at about 11:44, so I can wrap up and we should ask some questions.